Hello. Today I've got as a guest for the interview Olav Sorenson. He's a professor at many universities. He's been all around the world: US, Canada, UK, Hong Kong, Italy, Singapore, Norway, Australia. He's very well known, and honestly a bit thrilled, not a bit, I'm very thrilled to have him as a guest today. Olav, thank you very much for being present. Thank you.
Happy to be here.
I I stumbled upon your research a while ago, especially in connection with entrepreneurship. I've seen you've written a few studies and a few papers on the topic, where I would say there are two main topics that I picked out that I would like to talk about. The one aspect is the earnings, how much people make money in startups. You made a study about short term for the employees. You made another one for the long term success in their lives, where I've got a few questions about that. And the second thing that's very interesting to me was network effect, the geographical aspect of where you are and who you are around with. So
Sure.
let's start with the money, because I think that's an important aspect. With how is it if I start? Let's start not with the people who start the startup, but like the employees. Is it a good for me to work for a startup or not? What would you say? What was your...
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking just about the money, then it's probably not a great thing to work for a startup. It's the average employee of a startup is earning, kind of about 6% less initially. If you look at somebody who has the same kind of background, working in the same industry, but going to a large established employer, the person who goes to a startup is typically earning a little bit less. And in the long run, they actually earn quite a bit less, depending on how you're looking at it. They might earn anywhere, up to sort of 10, 12% less over, I call it the lifetime, but really we're talking over a 10-year period.
Okay.
I think it's worthwhile to also understand a little bit about, well, why is it that they're earning less? And we've did a little bit of research in trying to understand what were in some sense, the sources of the penalties. And one of the biggest sources of the penalties is that, the average startup fails, doesn't last forever. It maybe makes it for 3-4 years. And when it fails, the employees have to go and find another job. And where they really seem to kind of lose out is that when they find that next job, they're usually taking either a little bit of a pay cut, or they're earning about the same amount as they earned in their prior job. Whereas somebody who was working that whole time at a large established employer, is probably accumulating experience, maybe getting promoted. They're actually getting raises over time. So it's not that they're actually sort of seeing a decrease in their income, but relative to somebody who worked at a job continuously, they typically are earning less.
Yeah, that's an interesting finding. I would have, just from a gut feeling, thought that for the corporate, it would be interesting to have people that worked in startups, because I think they're the typical, more flexible, very ready to work a lot, to work hard, and flexible in their thinking, maybe not just in one department, but like connecting the dots. I would have thought that would be worth money to pay them a bit more to get them on their team. So that's not how it's played out for these people, huh?
Yeah, it's interesting. So, I mean, I think for entrepreneurs, for the founders, that does sort of happen. If you looked at, this isn't really my own paper, but if you look at other people who've done research on startup founders and what happens to them, even when they go back to an employer, I think a lot of times employers consider that experience very relevant for somebody who's going to enter the managerial ranks, right? Somebody who now understands how to manage people, knows a lot of different functions of the organizations. But the thing about, being, a more typical employee in a large firm is large firms usually have employees that are very specialized, right? They want people that are really good at some particular activity. And that's not what you develop as skills in a startup. In a startup, you learn how to do a little bit of everything. You're not really an expert in any one, but you know a
Jack
little
of
bit of
all
everything.
trades. Yeah.
Exactly. And so when you then are going back to, you know,
Yeah.
work for these larger employees, it's hard for them to make use of the type of experience, the type of human capital that you built.
Yeah, it's like you don't fit as well as a cog into the machine anymore, or like you
Right.
have to be uh, built into it and trained for it more to get into the right part of the machine in comparison with someone who's been there from the get-go, right after school or after the degree. You've been in it, worked years and years and years, maybe even if perfectly in the same company to learn all in and outs. Okay, that's something I can see. Absolutely interesting. And well, the likelihood that a startup fails is pretty high. I think how many, 8 in
Yeah.
10 or even more fail? That's
Well,
just part of the
yeah,
game.
I mean, it all depends on how long, you know, in the long run, almost all companies fail,
Yeah,
right?
okay.
So we really want to think about it as like, how long do they last? It turns
Yeah.
out that in Denmark, which is where I did a lot of this research, as well as in the US, the average company, so 50% of companies make it to about 4 years, right? And then if we look at, let's say 6 years, we'd be looking at maybe about 35% of companies making it to 6 years. And if we were looking at, you know, say 10 years, we'd probably be looking at maybe 25% of companies. So that, you know, that 8 of 10 failing is about right if you're thinking about maybe a 10 or 11-year arc.
Okay, 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 okay. Okay, that's interesting to know. And of these, so if I'm a young guy, I want to get a job, I've got the options to work for a typical company or for a startup. If I'm solely in it for the money, I would have to bet more on the startup, because if it fails, going back into corporate world does not give me really any money benefit. That's
Yeah, yeah. Well, you probably, I mean, if you're really in it just for the money, you want to probably go straight to the corporate job, right?
okay. Okay. What
Right.
about the big bet with the equity in a startup? We all know it's like the big lottery ticket. A lot of people that
Exactly.
work and that become part of the startup, especially at the very early phases, are like dreaming about that. Okay, I'll have my percentage of the multi-billion-dollar company, of course. What do you study? You studied that aspect too. So what?
Yeah, so we looked a little bit at that. I mean, in Denmark, that's less of an issue. And one of the reasons why is that in Denmark, equity awards are taxed like income. So if you're a startup employee, you really don't want to get stock, right? Because you're going to get taxed by the Danish government, and it's going to be illiquid stock that you can't even sell to pay your taxes, right? So it's kind of like the worst of both worlds.
Okay.
You know, in the U.S. And many other countries where equity is taxed, you know, the options in particular are taxed at the time they're exercised. Then it's more attractive because you only have to pay tax on it if it ends up being valuable and if you end up selling the options. But even in the US, what ends up happening is that very few people make it to the point where they're getting options. If you sort of think about those stats, you know, it's not just the, you know, the one in, let's say 1 in 4, if we're thinking about something like 75% lasting 10 years. To actually have the equity award payoff, there has to be some type of, you know, equity exit, either an acquisition for a fair amount of money. Oftentimes smaller acquisitions don't end up paying out much to the employees because the investors, the venture capitalists, are the first ones to get paid out, right? And so only if it's a very large acquisition is there enough cash to pay off the employees, or in an IPO. But, you know, if you think about, you know, kind of how many companies are getting backed by, say, venture capital relative to the number that are getting, you know, having an IPO, you know, you're talking about like 1 in 100 kind of chances of, you know, oftentimes of getting a payout.
So you've got a very, very low chance for the company to survive at all. And then if it survived, you've got a very low chance that you get a part of the acquisition money.
Right, exactly. And that's, you have to be a little bit careful also when looking at averages when you're thinking about things like that, because it's true that there are a few people who do just enormously well, right? So you see the stories of,
Yeah,
the first office assistant who becomes a, centimillionaire
yeah,
when a company goes public. And the problem is you throw just one or two people like that into the mix. And, imagine like if you were looking at your college graduating class, if you had one billionaire in your
yeah.
class, right, then it would look like everyone in the class is earning a fair amount of money. But really, it's just the one guy, and you're kind of dividing it among, 2,000, 3,000 plus people.
That's the interesting part. Always when I stumble upon statistics or numbers, and so, that the median is not used more commonly, but the average. It's like
Yeah.
I haven't yet understood why. It's something I'm gonna be honest, I don't quite understand, because the median value seems much more important to me than the average value. But well, I'm not an expert
Yeah,
in statistics.
well, I think you're right. I mean, I think one reason that people don't do research as much on medians is because the statistics for doing, for basically estimating the conditional mean, which is what you're doing usually in regression, are far more robust than for estimating the median. But I agree that, if we're really thinking about what is the typical person experiencing, we'd be much better off looking at medians, or even looking at, like some information on the whole distribution, like what do the different, kind of deciles look like.
That would be even more interesting. I know, because I read a lot of psychological studies, and there it was like, okay, a few people have a very high value in creativity, and the average was like all over the place, but the median worth was like zero, because a huge amount of people never wrote a book, never painted, never this, never played an instrument, and so on. So the median was zero, and that was my little beginning of the journey to like differentiate these two things, where I said, okay, that's interesting. The reality is not at all anywhere of the average. The median gets me much closer to the reality that I want to find from the studies.
Yeah.
It's good. Also, of course, the people will be a bit curious, because the channel is watched by a lot of entrepreneurs, by a lot of people that want to create startups, that just created startups, that hope for this lottery ticket of wealth and success and so on. Of course, we talked a bit negatively about jumping into a startup from now. And I want to be honest, I want to be clear. Yes, it is most likely a bad idea, and it's going to be not successful. I think it's important to be honest to the people, to not have like these rose tinted glasses and tell them, yeah, everybody's going to make it, everybody's going to be rich. It's just not the truth. But did your studies find something positive for the ones who jump into that field, especially for the employees who say, okay, I'm going to risk it, I'm going to take that job? Or is it like, nah, it's always a bad idea?
Yeah, no, I mean, there's we found I think a couple of things that are really interesting, that are sort of contingencies you could think about in how in the types of effects we found. So one that I thought was really interesting is that the people who join startups that are growing really fast, they actually do a little bit better than somebody who goes and joins a large corporation. So if you're in one of those high flying startups that's, doubling in the number of employees every, 6 months or something, then you might actually be better off in a startup. I think the hard thing is, at the time you're making the decision, are you able to spot that it's going to be a fast grower, or is that highly uncertain? The other thing that's I think an important caveat on this is that when we were looking at these results, it really depended on when you joined the startup. So the people who really earned less were the people who joined in just the first few employees. Like, think about employee number, 1 or 2 after the founders. By the time a startup reached about 50 employees in size, there was no
50 or
penalty at all.
50?
50.
50, okay. Okay.
Yeah. So by the time it reached that level in size, there was no penalty at all in joining a startup. So,
Okay.
I think, what part of what's happening is a lot of these people are, if you join a Facebook or something in its early days, even if it doesn't go public, you're going to do just fine, right? But the problem is a lot of people are joining these, app startups that maybe have one founder and it's not clear what the prospects are and they never go anywhere. And so they not only don't have kind of a successful exit from that startup, but they may also not even learn that much from the experience if it sort of never really went anywhere. And so that's a lot of what's driving this, kind of negative result for the average.
Okay, that's interesting. Have you witnessed or experienced or seen any in the data, anything like, because that's an interesting question that I had from a few people who wanted to join startups and weren't sure, because the question for someone jumping in is like, it's a small team. I'm gonna have to be jack of all trades at the beginning, of course.
Yeah.
So if the startup works out and they grow, are the first few employees usually being taken with them to the next stage and next stage? Like, it's a difference if I start, let's say, for example, in the marketing department as a jack of all trades, and after 5 years there are 100 people and we work with 5 agencies and I'm the CMO, then I think, of course, for the long-term success, it's good because now I can go to a big company and work there quite high. Or is it like, now once they reach 10 or 20 or 50 employees, they will kick me out to get someone who's had it in the CV from the get-go, and I don't even get the chance to grow into that role? Is there anything you could say to that?
Yeah. That's a great question. So I think of this as what I would call like maybe the rising tide effect, right? So if the company's growing, everybody who's there early gets lifted up and, kind of risen to a higher level. We don't really find much evidence for that. It actually looks like what tends to happen is more that if the company really takes off and grows, then what's going to happen is, when instead of promoting you to be the person who's now overseeing 20, 50 people in a marketing department, they bring in somebody who's experienced and has run a marketing department with 20 or 50 people, and you report to them. They probably don't fire you, and you do seem to move up a little bit faster, at least in income, than you would in a traditional company, which would be evidence that maybe you are getting promoted a little bit faster than you would have in a slower growth environment. But it's not like you become one of the C-level, C-suite sort of executives in a large company. What tends to happen is they bring in sort of the adults when they reach sufficient scale.
Oh, that it reminds me of two things. The first thing is the old rockets from the old way, and the ballast is just going off. Okay, we can't take you anymore. Sorry, we gotta get higher. Bye bye. Like, and then it reminds me of the Peter principle, where it's like, well, we can't fire you because it would be bad for the whole group, so we're gonna sideline you somewhere, maybe with a nice title, but let as you said, now let the adults work and play and go into the corner. Here you got hush money and that's it.
Well, and you see that a lot with founders, right? A lot of time founders, when these companies are really successful, will move into sort of a chief technical officer title, or title that's probably a little more ceremonial than real. And then, you've got, some seasoned executives that come and are actually running the organization.
Yeah, remember, I forgot the number, but it was like, I talked to an investor and he told me like 80, don't pin me on the number, might be wrong, but it was a high number, like 80% of founders, after they take off and they get the investment from venture capital or something, are sidelined in the next 2 or 3 years if the company works out, because they say, well, you don't have the qualities, you don't have the qualifications, you don't have the skills needed, so like, get out of the way and let us do it correctly and properly. And it's often a source of frustration for the founders, of course, as one can imagine. I mean, for the others who
It's
just
interesting.
I
mean, some of them, I think sometimes it's frustration, but sometimes people actually feel like once it gets to being, all about systems and reliability and A lot of them feel like they don't even fit. So they actually are, want to, leave and go and maybe actually do the next new venture because that's kind of more exciting, more interesting. And I think that actually points to something that we've kind of not even touched on in the conversation. We've been talking, about the money side, but I really think the reason why, people, if they're going to become a startup employee, should become an employee is not for the money. It's for, it's for being part of, this kind of creation process, which I think has its own, intrinsic satisfaction, even if it doesn't, have the same monetary reward.
Yeah, I'm absolutely on your side. It's just, I understand it, and I absolutely, in my heart, I feel it too, and I think it's the right thing. But I've seen so many people being lured in with false promises. And that's why I think it's important to say, hey, people, most cases, it won't work out. I liked, for example, Valuetainment PBD has a video about it on 5 reasons why not to be an entrepreneur. And I think it's good to tell us to people, like, if you want to be an artist, it's good to know, hey, man, an artist, most likely you won't sell paintings for millions. You will have trouble with money, you will do a lot of stuff that you don't want to do, and so on and so on. And after you're being told all of that negative stuff, if it's in your heart and your nature to still do it, then kudos, then go do it and enjoy it. But don't do it for the wrong reasons. And if all these people who stampeded into that field because of these wrong promises would be getting out of it, I think, as you said, all of those failing startups, a lot of those numbers would be lower, because often, at least in my experience, it's after 1 or 2 years, suddenly it's not fun because they thought, oh, I would be boss. I wouldn't have to work. I wouldn't have to do anything for the others. I thought I would have money. I would have free time. I could buy a Lamborghini and be at the beach. And it's like, no, man, that's not, you're not an entrepreneur if you do that, and that's not what you do. You work, and you work often more than anybody else in your company. You try to build it up because you have the passion in yourself to build it up. Like I don't know, maybe it's weird, but like in a video game where people build cities or a whole plan just for the sake of enjoying to build it. And I think that's something important. I think that's where the separation should be made a bit, to tell the people honestly, hey man, if that's your nature, cool, but if it's not your nature, it's not fun. I just had a call recently, that's why, with someone who started the business half a year, and then, no, it's not fun. Well, it's not supposed to be fun. That's why I'm a bit trying to shed light on that aspect. Channels, you will find 1,000 channels who say, hey, start up, build your own stuff, be an entrepreneur, you will make 100K per month, no work, no nothing, the others will be doing all the work. And I think that's such a dangerous message to the people, honestly.
Yes.
But I think you're right with your take on it. The creation process is something great. I myself am addicted to it. I create projects and businesses again and again, so I know exactly what you mean, and get myself good employees who are in it for this experience, for the experience of creating something and have an impact in the world. So with that, you're absolutely true. Sorry, I
no
keep
worries.
on rambling there. So let me ask, because a lot of what we talked about has to do with the success of the startup. And you've written a few papers that focus on network, geography, a few variables that can help or make it harder to become successful. Would you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. So, probably what I maybe in some ways am best known for in academia is some of the research that I've done on, where entrepreneurs start their business. I think sometimes there's a mistaken belief that if you're going to be an entrepreneur, especially like a tech entrepreneur, you need to go to some tech hub, like you need to go to Silicon Valley or, London or some place where there's just a ton of these, kind of other tech startups. In fact, what my research shows is that is not true at all. In fact, if you're not already in one of those hubs, it's probably the worst thing that you could do to go there. What you want to do usually is start a business someplace where you have deep contacts, usually someplace where you've been living for a long time, maybe your hometown. And so what we found in research using Danish data is that entrepreneurs who started their businesses in places where they'd lived longer, they grew faster, their businesses lasted longer, their businesses were more profitable. They actually had higher value add, so they were more productive as businesses. So really on every dimension, they were better. And there's other people who've shown essentially the same thing in Italy, in the United States, and Canada since then. So this seems like a pretty consistent principle.
Yeah, I found a few studies that pretty much said the same, I think by Fritsch, by Verwich, and by Kim and Aldrich. They all had pretty similar takes on it. It was quite curious for me. Do you have an idea why that is? Because usually the topic is like, okay, if you want to make it in X, you gotta go to Y. That's the usual.
Right.
Why is it better for me to stay in my hometown? I mean, most likely not a small village, but like, sure. Why is it better in my hometown and to use the connections that I have than to go to the big hub and make it there big?
Yeah, so I think the big reason is social relationships. So entrepreneurs are usually trying to do something without a lot of resources, right? They don't have a lot of money. They're trying to kind of figure out how to essentially get around these constraints. And a lot of the ways that successful entrepreneurs get around constraints is to recruit or get help from their friends, from acquaintances, from family. Most of your friends in particular tend to be local, right? If you think about who do you hang out with, who do you know well, they're usually people that live near you, you interact with on a regular basis. So what are different types of resources that an entrepreneur needs? Well, the first one is money, right? And if you look at most early money, it comes from friends and family, not from venture capitalists. So that can be helpful in getting their early capital. I think even more important is employees, right? So if you look at who gets hired by startups, most of those early employees, especially early employees that have the relevant industry experience, that have industry experience in the same industry as the startup, most of them are recruited through social networks. And actually, one of the studies that I'm working on right now that hasn't been published shows that on average, the people that are hired through these social networks are much higher quality if you look at their work experience, their salary prior to joining the startup and so forth, than employees that don't have any connection to the founders. And hiring those early employees through social networks seems to, again, be beneficial to the performance of the firm on almost every dimension. So I think a lot of this is really a story of recruiting.
That's really interesting, because I'm used to hear more of the opposite, like, oh, don't hire friends, don't hire family, take strangers because you can work with them differently. They will respect you more and so on. That's a typical advice. So you say, no, it's better to work in your social circle at first and to make it with the first steps in that circle. And important that the people you get through these social circles are of higher quality. Well, of course, they've got more social capital to lose if they mess up at their job. Most likely, that's interesting.
Yeah, I think the other thing that people tend, when we think about employment, a lot of times, we think about it as like, who are we choosing among as an employer? Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that's different for a founder is that employment is really a two-sided matching market. Right. And so employees are also deciding, where am I going to work among a set of options? And I think one of the difficult things for a founder is that, unlike, if you're like Deutsche Bank or something, right? Everybody knows what you are and there's no uncertainty and people are happy to work there. If you're some founder that's just put together a company, a lot of whether or not a person will take a job offer is whether they trust you as an employer and whether they have belief in your likely success.
True, absolutely true. That's why it's such a big difference for a startup. Like, how does the first office or how does the founder himself act, speak? How does he sell the vision? Absolutely true. Interesting take. It's a very interesting take. When do you think that paper will be coming out? How much time more do you take?
Well, I'm working on it with a couple of co-authors who one is going to go on one just had a child and is going to go on the job market. So it's going to take a while. If we're lucky, it's going to be maybe a couple years.
Okay. But nice to hear from you. Thanks for the little heads up. I gotta ask a quick question. It's not in your papers,
Sure.
but I just gotta ask now. If I have a bad social circle for the startup that I want to create, let's say typical lower socioeconomic class, for example,
Sure.
or something like that, or my parents are migrants, they don't have a good circle, I don't, something around multitude of possible scenarios. Should I move to one of those hubs, or should I look to create a network where I am right now? Is it like, okay, if you aren't that well rooted,
Right.
it's better to go into the hub, or is it better to create it a little with less competition, so to speak? Because many people in those hubs will have those social circles. Do you know?
I think, well, I mean, I don't, I haven't tested this specifically, but my intuition based on, kind of the different pieces of research I've done is that you're better off staying and trying to build a better social network where you are. Precisely because in these hubs, there's a tremendous amount of competition. If you're not really well connected in the hubs, it's hard to be successful. But it's possible to upgrade your social network. Sometimes there's some really interesting accounts of some people who have very creatively built social networks. So one that I love, actually, I teach it as a case in my class in venture capital, is Pear VC. I don't know if you've heard of this company. But the guy who founded it is this immigrant to the United States, and he, because he doesn't know English that well, and he doesn't have that, doesn't really have the degrees and things. So he starts selling rugs, like literally, carpets, right? But in Palo Alto. And so he starts meeting all of these venture capitalists and successful entrepreneurs who are, furnishing their homes, and starts building this incredible network of very well-connected individuals as a rug salesman. And then as he becomes a successful rug salesman, he actually starts being an angel investor and investing in some startups. He has a lot of success. And so now he's actually running his own VC fund off the basis of having built this, network as a rug salesman.
That's an interesting story. Wow. That's interesting. That's cool. I gotta tell. That's a nice story.
Yeah.
Wow. Awesome. Interesting take to like stay where you are, if it's possible, of course. Like 100 people village somewhere in nowhere will be hard, but like a typical normal city. Okay, that's very interesting. We don't have much time. I want to squeeze a little thing into it if possible.
Sure.
One of the papers was quite interesting to me. I'm in marketing and everything, and I'm working a lot with online. It was the billing status in an online community. You work with Stack Overflow, I think, with the data. It's about how to get social capital, like in the hierarchy, how to get the higher places in an online community, if I understood it correctly. And you said you wrote them. It's like, now please, you say it in your words. You say it in your words.
So there's been a lot of research on status, but not that much of it has looked at how people actually build status. One of the things that's tricky is, before you have status, how do you get people to, sort of be convinced that you're higher quality? And so what the argument we make and what we find some evidence for is that the way that you start moving up the hierarchy is by showing competence, right? You really have to, in the case of Stack Overflow, be either asking some really insightful questions or giving correct answers, good answers to programming questions that other people have. What's interesting, that's not surprising. What's interesting is that once you reach a certain level of status, then it kind of switches, and continuing to move up to become ever higher and higher status increasingly seems to depend on things that are actually completely unverifiable in their correctness or quality. So making, kind of judgments about what is the next kind of interesting, maybe programming language, or pronouncements about, where AI is going, all of these things that are oftentimes very amorphous, very big picture. And in a sense, like, you could be completely wrong, and yet that's precisely what seems to then confer additional increases in status. So it's kind of an interesting process as, some people are making that shift, and, that they continue to go up and up in status. Other people kind of stick with the more, just giving the correct answers, being very helpful to the community, and they actually don't become as high status in the long run.
There also was something where I was a bit interested or confused about it when I read it. It was like, it seems to be like there are tiers where, like, if you manage to get to this level and one step more, you'll get tremendous upside. While if you are just one step underneath, you are way below. And there are multiple such tiers where it's like, okay, on each level you gain much more respect for very little more, in something like that. That's how I understood it. I want to test that.
Yeah, so that's not necessarily a piece of the theory. That's more like how we actually did the empirics. And so what we were looking at is whether or not like the returns to making a certain type of contribution, like how much sort of credit do you get for having a good answer, does that change depending on your current status level? And so we showed, and we basically, the cuts that we're making there are somewhat artificial, and we're just cutting the data into either quartiles or quintiles in order to just have some different cut points. But the kind of thing that's fundamentally interesting is that the returns are different depending on where you are. If you're near the bottom, the returns to giving the correct answers are much higher than if you're already near the top. Whereas these ambiguous questions are also interesting. At the bottom, making a pronouncement about like the future of AI or sort of the value of some programming language gets you literally zero. Nobody cares. If you've already established a fair amount of status, then making that kind of statement can get you additional attention and actually continue to elevate your status.
That's very interesting when I think about experts and influencers and like in the field, the people who know. That's interesting because it's a typical thing of, if you already have, you get even more. If you already have a voice, right, people will like to listen to you even more, and they will put more weight into your voice. That's an interesting take.
Absolutely.
Well, Olav, thank you very, very much. Thank you. I could talk 1 or 2 more hours with you easily. Honestly, I'm so curious. I've got 2 more papers filled with questions, but I know your time is valuable, and I thank you very much that you took your time for this interview. I wish you and your family just the very, very, very best, and I thank you for having been on this show. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure. Hope you have a good evening.